charges. Like Don said, we are working on implementing a new process that was approved by the board last summer. And so we'll get into that a little bit. So some of this, if you've attended one of these presentations before, will be, how it's always been done. And then some of the presentation will be talking about what the new process is. So especially with the new process, be sure to ask those questions if you have any, and we'll get going. Like Don said, you can raise your hand or pop something in the chat, and that will alert me to the question. So today we're going to talk about what are annual charges for service, what is the process that Metro goes through to determine what those charges are. How do we allocate the charges to connectors? We have, like I said, a new and an old process. And how do we get that information? How do we know how to do all of this? So let's go ahead and get started. So annual charges is Metro's user fee to the connectors. So as most of you know, we are a wholesale operator of wastewater services. So we have 65 connectors, some of which we bill directly, some of which are passed through from our connectors. And so we are assessing a user charge, and we call those annual charges. So we use our user fee or annual charges for service for operating budget, for paying some debt back, and also for capital costs. So it really is all encompassing. It is our primary revenue source. It's not our only revenue source, but it does account for, over 70% of our total revenue. We calculate the total annual charges for service and the allocation to connectors during the budget process. We're doing that right now for 2027. We did it during the same time last year for 2026. And all of that process is governed by the service contract that our connectors have signed with us and the rules and regulations that the board of directors has adopted. And we base everyone's annual charge for service based on the connector's use of the system. So we are measuring in some form or fashion the flow and then the demand of treatment on the system with the BOD, the SS, the TKN, and the CEC units there, which are defined for you. All right, so like I said, we do this during the budgeting process. So during 2026, we assessed where we were in terms of how much we had available to us to spend. So that's our beginning fund balance, what our revenue needs were, what our other revenue streams are or might be, and then compared that to our expenses. Operating expenses, our capital projects, some equipment that we need to replace or to buy new, and our debt service payments. So every single year we're going through this process of determining, all of these things, making, some estimates, not only for the current year that we're working on. So right now we're working on 2027, but we're also taking a look at that into the future 20 years. So we have a 20-year cash flow model, which identifies, if we set an annual charge amount in 2026, what happens over that 20-year period, what's happening with our expenses during that time, what are revenue requirements, do we need to issue more debt, and those sorts of things. So we are looking at this all encompassing over a 20-year period. Our annual charges are described as a percentage increase, from the prior year. So I will say our annual charges increased 8%, or they are increasing 5%, or that sort of thing. So we're setting it based on the look back to the prior year's total, and using that percentage as kind of an indicator of how these things are changing over time. So for 2026, we budgeted for and the board adopted annual charges of $184 million, which is representing an 8% increase over 2025. Now, the year before, in 2025, many of you are aware that we had a 10% increase over the prior year. And that really was a result of some very significant increases in operating expenses, not only for inflation, which we all have been experiencing both in operations and capital, but also an increase in our service area with adding some new connectors. So while we did have those increases, ultimately those costs are shared over a broader base, more connectors. Just in terms of other revenue streams, our other major revenue stream is our sewer connection charges. That's the tap fee for each new connection or change to connection to the system. So it's a one-time charge. And so we're estimating, every year about $60 million from tap fees. So that really does depend upon the economy and how things are going, out there in the world, who's developing, who's redeveloping, and those sorts of things. The other tool we have in our toolbox is bonds. We can issue debt. We're an enterprise fund, so we have the ability to issue bonds, and we are in 2026 issuing bonds. This is showing bond proceeds of 200 million. We actually went to market last week, had a very successful sale, and we actually only issued total bonds of 136 million. So that's all been incorporated into that 20-year plan, even though that doesn't quite match the budget. As you know, budgets are, estimations, and as soon as you put it down on paper, they are outdated and need to be adjusted. So every single year we're going through this process. We're determining our inflows and our outflows, and we're determining those total annual charges. Once we have that total amount, like we talked about on that last slide for 2026, our total amount of annual charges is $184 million. We then had to determine how to allocate that out to all of our connectors. And the allocation out to the connectors is based on the use of the system. And so we have to set a unit charge based on the total number of units that are going into the system, or that we think is going to go into the system. In this case, it was based on the 2026 projections. In the old methodology, we'll talk about that here in a second, we asked you all for how much you thought you would use of the system. And then so we get total units and we calculate the unit charge. That's going to change just a little bit when we get to 2027. But really, we're looking at those 5 parameters. We're identifying how much cost is related to each of those, how many units there's going to be in each one of those areas, and then we calculate the unit charge. One of the things that I will note is that there's multiple factors or multiple variables affecting annual charges. So while we have a total amount of annual charges, you as connectors are being charged not only based on your total usage of the system, but also in relation to your partners, your other connectors. So if somebody is using more of the system than they thought, that may make your allocation go down, or vice versa. Maybe they're using a little bit less than they thought, maybe their flow is going down, or they had an industry move out. That might mean they're using less of the system. So there's multiple factors in relation to the actual connectors payments that we will eventually get to. So this slide is just showing you how we break out those costs. And then something I just wanted to point out that, over time, our annual charge parameter allocation, in total compared to each other changes over time. So flow, may be going down a little bit in terms of overall allocation to the total costs of treatment. That's because flow is going down a little bit. When flow goes down, because constituents, stay at the same level or increase because there's more units but lower flow from those, appliances, or lower flow of toilets and those sorts of things, saving water, you kind of see how things adjust over time. So we end up, having less costs associated with flow and more costs associated with, in this case, suspended solids. All right, so let's talk about what we did in 2026 to allocate out those annual charges, the old process, to you all as connectors. So the old process, which was still in effect for the 2026 year, involved a 3-year cycle. Now, this 3-year cycle involved having an estimated amount, revising the estimated amount, and then have a final adjustment. So in this slide, you're looking at the same total amounts, but allocated out based on different estimates. So we had a certified estimate, we have a revised estimate, and then we have that final adjustment. Both the certified estimate and the revised estimate are just what they are. They're estimates before the year started or during the year, and we make adjustments. So that would change the unit charge. That final estimate is actually what happened during that year. So what did happen? Let's take a look back and we make a final adjustment. So each time we go through this iteration for a particular year, we would have 3 different calculations of annual charges, which would then affect your future annual charge payments. So in any one year, you would see on your bill, certified estimate, revised estimate, and final adjustment, coming up to a total payment. So here's that same example here for the total number of units. You can see how the units will change. In fact, this is Bear Creek. I'm picking on Bear Creek Water and Sanitation District. You can see how their total units changed over time with that final adjustment. Those first 2 numbers, the estimates, are the same, but when we came back in and actually looked at their total actual flow, it was different. And so you can see they had some adjustments to their annual charges over time. So for example, in 2026, your bill for 2026 reflects the full amount for 2026 estimate, change for the 2025 revised, and then the 2024 final adjustment, because all of that was calculated last year. I have a wordy slide here that's going to say that same exact thing. So for 2026, we had the certified estimate from 26, we had the 25 revised estimate, and then we have the final adjustment from 2024. So each payment calculation had all of these components in it. Again, every connector is being charged the same unit price during every iteration. It just gets divided up a little bit differently depending upon the total number of units. So many of you may have seen these annual charges per service net payment calculation. This is included in our budget document, as well as probably is provided to the connectors on a regular basis. But this is that calculation to get to the 2026 net payment amount for Bear Creek. And then this is what the amount that Bear Creek is paying this year. So they had some adjustments from prior years that reduced kind of this overall all cost. At the same time, because the total amount of annual charges isn't changing in any given year or collecting that full amount, somebody else's bill maybe went up a little bit or had an adder because Bear Creek's went down a little bit. Again, multiple variables for each one of these iterations. So one of the things that, or some of the things that, the board has been talking about with staff is that each year seemed to be a surprise with how much the payment would be. One year, for example, you'd pay $1 million. The next year, you'd be paying $800,000, and the next year, paying $1.2 million. So just kind of swing all over the place. And again, this is because there's multiple variables, and the multiple variables are dependent upon how well or not connectors were doing at kind of guessing what their usage would be. And again, that's all in relation to everyone else's usage. So if you were off and everyone else was off a little bit, which is natural because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. If you do, give me that crystal ball. We'll do Vegas odds together. But since we don't know what's going to happen, it's natural to kind of maybe overestimate or underestimate, and then we catch that up over time. But that might mean these big swings in payments. And while some connectors may have dollar amount little swings, that's still the same effect for a small connector who has less cash flow than a large connector with huge swings, but still the same sort of relative feeling of, I don't know what to expect. So we, during 2024 and 5, we did a rate study, and we asked our rate study partner, Carollo, to come up with some options of how we could change our rate design methodology. And so the board, went through the process. We gave them some options, and the board did approve for 2027 a new methodology, which will actually use a backwards-looking 3-year rolling average that will replace this estimation process. So instead of guessing forward what those annual or what your usage is going to be, we're going to look backwards. So for example, for 2027, we'll look back at the actual usage for 25, 24, and 23. And so what we did is we went back about 10, 15 years worth of data. And what we saw when we did that, just looking backwards at all of our connectors and their data, it really smoothed out those kind of huge swings and fluctuations and made it a lot smoother over time. So if things are kind of increasing, they track up a little bit, but not spike up. Or if things are tracking down, they decrease a little bit and track downwards. So rather than having these big swings, it will be easier for connectors to manage those cash flows, to manage those future payments and be able to estimate those better. Some of the things that we went through are some pros and cons. So, you know, the existing methodology has stable revenue. Connectors were familiar with it, even if it is quite complicated, and it accounts for actual data. What it didn't do was create predictability from billing. It still is complicated to explain. So with a 3-year rolling average, it still has the same stable revenue stream to Metro. The total amount still remains the same of those annual charges. It really is based on that actual data and will be more predictable than the existing methodology. Now, some of the cons, though, you know, there is a lag in information. So if you're having an extreme growth period in your community and you're going up, well, you're not going to go up as quickly, but eventually you're going to catch up with that usage, and it's going to affect, you know, everyone else's will slightly ratchet down while you're ratcheting up, or vice versa. The other thing is, if we have a new connector or we have a new connection, we won't have a lot of data. So we'll have to put in some procedures to kind of manage, you know, those newer connections. You know, but we have that written in there, and we have some methodologies for being able to do that internally. So what did this do really in terms of our timeline? Well, it means you as connectors do not have to provide estimates to us. We will not be reaching out to you here in the next few days and saying, hey, tell me what you're going to do next year. So that's great news. Well, we still will be reaching out to you, however, because we're still going to give you your 2025 final flows and loadings reports, which you'll have 60 days to review. So that still happens in March, but we won't be asking for estimates. And the other thing is that the only other time we're going to reach out to you to get more data is your commercial water usage there in November. So we still do that for your estimated areas, reaching out to you. But other than that, we're just going to let you be. You know, you can just contact us if you have any questions, rather than us kind of, you know, bothering you for giving us, you know, your crystal ball efforts in terms of what those flows and loads are going to be into the future. It also changes kind of our cycle. So we are required by the rules and regulations to establish the annual charges and determine how much everyone's payment is going to be by September 1st of every year. So to do that, we had this kind of structured process, and we'd adopt the budget in June, and then in July we'd do some other things, and then in August we would then kind of set those charges, because we had these strict timeframes in terms of when we're getting the estimates, when you're certifying the finals, those sorts of things. However, because we don't have to get estimates anymore, once we have those certified final flows and loads, we can do our calculation for annual charges allocation, because we have the prior 2 years data already, 24 and 23. We just need to add in 25. So instead of waiting to August to do that kind of final adoption of annual charges and that net payment amount, we actually can do that in June. So instead of waiting until you know, the end of June to kind of give you a look-see of what we think it might be, we're actually going to send you your net payment amount that's been approved by the board in June. We'll probably have those numbers calculated, though, by the end of May, if not a little bit sooner. So we can also give you some reach outs and some estimates prior to that. So it's going to speed up the process just a little bit more. So if some of you have some budgeting processes that start not quite as early as ours, but almost as early, you might be able to get some better information about what your payment's going to be for the next year, and hopefully get that into your budget process. So these are the action items that the board will take, and the only two things for you all in terms of connectors is that March reach out in terms of reviewing your final flows and loads report, and then November request. I'm going to pause. Yes, I am going to pause there and see if there's any questions about the old process, the new process, before we get into how we get the data. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Molly, this is Zeke from Denver Wastewater.
Oh, hi, Zeke.
Hello. Thank you for doing this. I had heard that there was going to be some differences, so I appreciate it. A couple of questions. First, when we get our estimate for 2027, does that include the new tap connections, or is it just for treatment? Is that certified value?
That amount we will still adopt the sewer connection charge rate in July. So when we send out notice of what your connector net payment will be in June, that's just for the treatment.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Now,
we'll still do that action item in July.
Right. Okay. Second question. Can I ask you, with this rolling 3-year average, on the surface to me sounds good, but what do you do if, say, we'll take Denver, if we for some reason contributed a lot more, so that means it costs you more, but you're just doing an average. Do you guys worry about ending in a deficit or something, or how do you just I guess my question is the 3-year average, is that sustainable for you guys, right? In case there's drastic changes, or in the example you had, what if you get a new connector that contributes a lot? Then I would think I would pay a little bit less, right? So I'm just wondering how that's all worked into the new system you have here.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think from a methodology standpoint for Metro, we are still calculating out the total amount of annual charges and still then dividing that up among the connectors. It's just really the methodology to get to that unit rate. Instead of unit rates being based on future looking or estimates, it's based on past looking. And so Metro itself is really sitting in the same place in terms of revenue. We set that charge every year, and we adjust that 20-year look. And so I feel, comfortable that, since there's really nothing changed in terms of total annual charges, we will be in the same place. And if things change operationally, if we have, our largest risk in terms of budgeting is those sewer connection charges. If those don't come in, we have reserves that can cover for that, and we plan for changes. Or if there's a huge operational swing like we've had with inflation, or something breaks, we always have some, just like you all plan for kind of medium, not worst case, but something could happen, but we have reserves in order to cover some of those things, and then we just would work through it as we normally do. In terms of new connectors, that also is a really great question. In fact, we had 2 new connections during 2025 into the system. Both connections were existing. So South Adams County took a portion of their service area and diverted it to Metro, to the Northern Treatment Plant, and then Fort Lupton connected from the north side and is bringing their flow down. So we actually have been collecting data over the last couple of months for both of those connections, and can use that as kind of an assemblage of some sort of estimate in terms of what their flow and their loadings have been. So that's really how we're handling connections in terms of, the rules and regs give us the opportunity to look at various methodologies if we need to. We can estimate that based on how we need, and adjust over time, or take actual data and extrapolate that out if we need to, and that sort of thing. And so that's really the plan for that. If we have a new connection, meaning we have a new service area and they're just sending us ones and twosies, those are going to come through flow meters, but we'll probably establish some estimates for those connections, just so we're making sure we have something in the system. So again, it's not going to be perfect, but it will get us through that 3-year period, and then get them up and going with those 3-year averages like everyone else.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. And so I assume as we move forward, there's no more going to be the debit credit thing that you were talking about, right? Which is, I think it's preferred. So thank you very much.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, looks like you're up.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to, so I do like this better. Before it was based on sort of a future prediction and then all these corrections afterwards, right? This is based on actual data from the past. So I like it more. However, with us just starting this like this year, what does happen to the debits and credits that we may or may not have actually been a lot, allocated this year and next year for the water we've already discharged? If we're starting this new and this year is based on the last 3 years average, is there debits and credits that are still remaining out there from the previous years?
No, we did talk about that and how and essentially, no, it
Okay.
just switches over to the 3-year average. Because there really is no more estimation or debits and credits at this point.
So
And
we didn't
so
overpay.
even if I thought about like how I would do that, switching over to this new methodology, all we're doing is a look back
Yeah.
based on the unit charges, and or based on that total usage, establishing the unit charges, and then about establishing your payment based on that average number of average usage that you've used in the past.
So this year, what normally would have happened is there would have been that final, right? Like you said in the beginning, and then there would have been, the leftovers from the previous years. When we start this, we're saying there are no leftovers from those previous years from what we've already paid, debits or credits, and we're just going to start right now using the last 3 years average, right? So all the revised estimates that would have happened would have found that we had either overpaid or underpaid. And I guess I'm trying to just understand that in this case, that's not, even though going forward, that's not a thing. What about what we already just paid? Because we were technically still on the old system. And now we're switching. In the old system, we might have owed you money or the other way around today. Like we may have overpaid or underpaid, right? For the previous 2 years. Or previous
Again,
year.
I mean, we took a look at that.
Yeah.
After discussing, there really is not a methodology to ease into this in terms of,
Okay.
we'll spend one more year. We're either making it based on estimates and doing those adjustments, or we're not. And that is the methodology that the consultant and staff recommended the board, and the board adopted. So yeah, we are just going to go a clean cut. I don't think
makes
about
sense.
it in
We
terms
could have
of
owed you money. That would have been terrible. So I didn't,
well, I don't think about it in terms of somebody owing or somebody
Yeah.
not owing. It's really just that kind of harsh up and down to a smoother kind of rolling.
Okay.
Graham?
I was going to say there's another hand up.
Let me get my
Randy?
microphone on. Yeah, can you hear me
Okay.
now?
Yeah.
If I get this right, the 27 payments are the average of 25 actual, 24 actual, and 23 actual, which I get that. That sounds good. And so the 27 payment, when the actual comes in for 27, the actual flows, is there an adjustment between the estimate that we were paying and the actual?
No, because all we're doing is really establishing. So if we go back to, if I can do this, let me see my little bar. If we go back to, say, for example, the slide where you're seeing those unit charges, the unit charge is only going to be established one time every single year. In the old methodology, we established the method or the unit charge 3 times for any given year.
Right.
So
Understood.
all we're doing is establishing that unit charge one time, multiplying that unit charge times your average usage, and setting that payment.
So there's no adjustment on the usage side between the average of the last 3 years and the actual for the year in question.
No. It's very similar to a winter average for a residential unit. You would look at that winter average. Maybe they used 3,000 gallons of water, 2,000 and 4,000. On average, that's 3. Okay, that's how you're billing them the wastewater fee on a monthly basis. Next year, you do the math over again, or maybe you adjust it every couple of years or something. And so it's that same methodology.
Okay.
It's just on a larger scale. Other questions? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the sampling process. So how do we get this data? So as many of you know, we have connections. We have over 100 connections into the system from you all. And those are all categorized based on the rules and regulations. So the rules and regulations says we have these different types of customer categories. Here's a chart that gives you these letters, and we establish that. So that approved by the board, all these connections every single year. So for very large connections, they might be an A or a B category where we're monitoring the flow on a regular, on a daily basis. We're looking at that flow's coming in, and we're taking those reads. However, we're only taking a look at the sampling of what is coming through there, the constituents that are coming through there on a periodic basis. So for very large connections that have maybe unreliable loadings, maybe it's an industrial area that sometimes fluctuates, we'll go out there 11 to 13 times a year to do samples. If it's a more reliable area, maybe it's a very large area of purely residential, we'll go out there less frequently, 5 to 7 times, and so on and so forth. So we have some connections, or most connections, that are continuously monitored, some that we go out there periodically and monitor the flow. And then we have some areas that are just estimated. So we're not actually monitoring the flow. And that's part of the reason why we get those commercial water usage from you on those E connections, those estimated connections. And again, some of the sampling is estimated, but for the most part, we're out there getting those samples for these very large connections. So that's, again, based on the rules and regulations. Some things to note about the sampling period is we're not allowed to tell you before we go out there. We are allowed to tell you the day we start sampling. Sometimes connectors want to know just so that they can pull their own samples on the same day and compare data, or use that same data to then bill their industrial connectors, so it kind of matches up with what our flows and loadings are showing. We sample for a period of 7 days in a row. If we miss a day, if there's something that happens to the sample, we make up that day the next week, or as soon as we're able to, on the same day. So if we miss a Tuesday, we'll be back out there on the Tuesday. So we're trying to match up day to day. And every single year we try and, manage how we're sampling. So try not to hit the same, holiday week for the same connectors over and over again. Sometimes that gets a little tough. We have tons and tons of sampling to do, and that sampling team is super busy out there. We are out there a lot verifying that those things are working right. If you notice anything with those flows and loads reports that we send you on a regular basis, something doesn't seem right, reach out and check in with us, see if something, if you're noticing something in the data that looks a little funny. And we can help figure out if that is working right or not. Here's what one of those sampling metering station looks like. So they have these cabinets which has some equipment in it. There's the vault that the flow is rolling through there on the wastewater side. There's if you want to hear this presentation again, you're always welcome to join on March 12th at 8 a.m. Oof, 8 a.m. Why did I sign up for that? And then the very important contact information. So because, you deserve to have the answers, as quickly as possible, make sure that if you have questions on any one of these topics, to send it to one of these email addresses, either annual charges at Metro Water Recovery or sewer connections at Metro Water Recovery. And that goes to a team of us. And so if we know somebody's out, Pam is out or Jensen is out, or maybe they're both out, I'll pop in there and answer a question here and there, just depending. And so make sure that you have that contact information. I know, Don, since we're recording this, that's great, but also, did we make this slideshow available? Is it attached? Can't remember.
Yeah, it's attached to the invite, everybody. And
Okay.
we can resend it out as well.
Yeah. So that really is the end of my prepared remarks, but happy to answer any additional questions.